Let's picture the Roman Empire for a second. But don't picture the gleaming marble powerhouse. Instead, imagine a building that's about to completely collapse. For 50 straight years, its foundations have been rocked by civil war, by plague, by total economic ruin. And then one man steps out of the chaos, a soldier, Diocletian, and he has a plan. But his plan isn't to patch up the old empire. No, his plan is to tear it down to the studs and build something totally new, something he believes will be stronger in its place. This is the story of his radical, brutal reforms, and how they didn't just save the empire, they completely reinvented it.
But before we dive in, we have to tackle the biggest question of all. We've all heard the story of the fall of the Roman Empire. But what if that's, well, kind of the wrong way to look at it? What if it wasn't one big dramatic event, but something way more complicated? A slow, messy, and honestly fascinating transformation. That's what we're going to dig into.
All right, so here's our game plan. We're going to start by rethinking that whole idea of the fall of Rome. Then we'll jump right into the chaos of the 3rd century to see the absolute mess Diocletian inherited. After that, we'll look at his wild, iron-fisted reforms, explore their often brutal hidden costs, and finally, see how his actions actually built a whole new kind of empire from the ashes of the old one. Okay, let's start with that big idea. For generations, the story was pretty simple, right? Rome rose, Rome had its golden age, and then Rome fell. Barbarians at the gates, corruption inside, game over. But modern historians, they have a very, very different story to tell. They've actually redefined the whole period. They call it late antiquity. And just look at that time frame, from 200 all the way to 800 AD. We're talking about a 600-year process. This wasn't a sudden death. It was a really slow evolution. The old Roman world didn't just blink out of existence. It morphed into the 3 great civilizations that would basically define the next 1,000 years. It's a story of transformation, not just a simple story of destruction. So, to really get why Diocletian had to be so extreme, you have to understand the world he was born into. This was not the glorious empire of Augustus or Marcus Aurelius, not even close. This was the crisis of the 3rd century, and it was a complete and utter nightmare. It was a perfect storm of political, economic, and social collapse. For 50 years, the empire was just a battlefield. You had more than 20 so-called barracks emperors in that short time, mostly generals who were hailed as emperor by their troops, only to be murdered a year or 2 later. I mean, becoming emperor was basically signing your own death warrant. Throw in a devastating plague that wrecked the population and whole chunks of the empire just breaking away, and you've got a state that's pretty much stopped working. And a huge driver of all this chaos? The economy. Desperate for money to pay the armies that kept them in power, emperors started, well, cheating. They minted coins like this one that looked legit, but they had less and less actual silver in them. It's called debasement. They were literally watering down the money supply. And the result? People completely lost faith in the currency. It'd be like finding out your $20 bill was suddenly only worth $5. And you can see the direct result right here, hyperinflation. Just look at these numbers. For the first couple of centuries, inflation was super low, less than 1%. Everything was stable, predictable, but by the 4th century, after all that currency debasement, it just explodes to nearly 23% a year. This wasn't just an economic problem, it was a social disaster. It wiped out people's life savings, it killed trade, and it made planning for the future absolutely impossible. This is the broken world Diocletian inherits. So you can see why Diocletian knew that just tinkering around the edges wasn't going to cut it. The whole system wasn't just broken, it was rotten to its core. He decided the only way to save the empire was to remake it from the ground up, through sheer force of will. He was going to be the architect of a brand new Roman state. His first and most famous idea was the tetrarchy, the rule of 4. He saw 2 huge problems. 1, the empire was just too big for one guy to manage, and 2, there was no peaceful way to hand off power, which led to all those assassinations. The tetrarchy was his solution to both. It was a radical attempt to hardwire stability right into the system. And here's the org chart, basically. Diocletian split the empire into East and West. Each half was ruled by a senior emperor, called an Augustus. He took the wealthier East for himself and gave the West to his buddy Maximian. Then, each Augustus adopted a junior emperor, a Caesar, who was supposed to be his heir. The logic was brilliant, really. A team of 4 to manage the territory, and a clear line of succession to stop the endless cycle of murder. But he didn't stop there. Oh no. The Tetrarchy was just the start. He doubled the number of provinces, slicing them into smaller, more controllable pieces. He split up civilian and military jobs so a general couldn't just use his army to take over. He massively expanded the military to lock down the borders. He created this super rigid new tax system to guarantee that money kept flowing in. And maybe most importantly, he totally changed what it meant to be emperor. Gone were the days of first among equals. The emperor was now an autocrat, a godlike figure. You didn't just say hi to him, you had to prostrate yourself on the ground before him. This was a new, top-down, authoritarian state.
And you know what? It worked. Diocletian stabilized the empire. He ended the crisis of the 3rd century. He ruled for 21 years and was the first emperor ever to voluntarily retire. By all measures, a huge success. But that success came at a staggering price. So it's time to look at the other side of the ledger. So, to fight that runaway inflation we saw earlier, Diocletian issued his infamous Edict on Maximum Prices. It was a direct, brute force approach. He set legal price limits on, well, everything. Wheat, wine, clothes, even wages, over 1,000 items. And if you charged more, the penalty was death.
And this slide right here just perfectly captures the huge disconnect. Diocletian genuinely seemed to believe the problem was just simple greed. You can read it in his edict. He goes on and on about greedy merchants. But as historian David Potter puts it, the whole thing was an act of economic lunacy. It completely ignored basic supply and demand, shipping costs, you name it. And the result was totally predictable. Goods just disappeared from legal markets, a massive black market blew up, and the policy was quietly dropped. A complete and total failure.
And the cost wasn't just measured in coins, it was measured in lives. Diocletian was a traditionalist, and he saw the new Christian faith as a direct threat to Roman unity. His solution was extermination. The Great Persecution was the most systematic, brutal attack on Christians in the empire's history, but it backfired spectacularly. The stories of the martyrs only made the faith stronger, and in one of history's greatest ironies, just 2 decades later, the next major emperor, Constantine, would not only end the persecution, but put Christianity on the path to becoming the state religion.
And then there was a cost we don't often think about, an environmental one. That huge new army, the bigger government, all those building projects, they all needed fuel. And in the Roman world, fuel meant wood. An estimated 90% of all energy came from burning wood. This led to deforestation on a scale Europe had never seen before, which caused soil erosion and may have even changed local climates. The stable new state Diocletian built was incredibly hungry for resources. So, when the dust finally settles, what's Diocletian's final report card? He created order from chaos, no doubt, but his vision of restoring a unified Roman past? It failed. The Tetrarchy, the price controls, the persecutions, they all crumbled. So, what actually lasted? What was his real long-term impact? All right, let's tally the score. His big political system, the Tetrarchy, it fell apart in a civil war almost the minute he retired. His economic and religious policies, yeah, total disasters. But now, look at what endured. The administrative split of the empire into East and West, that became permanent. The massive centralized theocracy he built, that became the backbone of government for centuries. And his model of the remote, all-powerful divine emperor, that became the new normal. And this right here, this is the most crucial point of all. His high-tax, top-heavy, autocratic state was just too much for the poorer, less developed western half of the empire to handle. It actually sped up its decline. But in the wealthier, more urban East, his reforms were a perfect fit. They created a state that was strong enough to survive for another 1,000 years. So you see, Diocletian didn't save the old Roman Empire of Augustus. He accidentally built the foundation for its successor, the Eastern Roman or Byzantine Empire. Which brings us right back to where we started, with this question of transformation. Was Diocletian the last great emperor of the ancient world, desperately trying to hold on to the past? Or was he, through all his brutal, authoritarian, and world-changing reforms, actually the first man of the new medieval world? Maybe the real answer is that he was both, a complicated, contradictory giant of a figure, standing right at the crossroads of history.